Imagine you work all year long, no holidays, no days off. You farm the land, and on payday they don't hand you any money. They just put down a single mark next to your name, a little stick, a tally in the bookkeeper's ledger. You can't quit, and if you try to run to the city, you can end up behind bars. Besides, what would you even do in the city when you have no papers? You might think I'm describing a cotton plantation in 19th century America, but no, this is Europe, the middle of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. While the West was listening to rock and roll and the Soviet Union was getting ready to put a man into space, tens of millions of people in the heart of Europe were living in legalized slavery, and almost nobody in the West knows about it. Hi, I'm Roman and I'm from Ukraine. On this channel I tell you things about Western civilization what you've never heard before. So subscribe, this won't be pleasant, but you need to know it. Soviet propaganda sold the world a pretty picture: happy peasants, shared property, everyone equal, everyone working their own land together. But there's a fairly obvious problem with this scheme, one the West never stopped to think about. Because for peasants to work shared land, that land first had to be taken away from those very same peasants. Until the 1930s, Ukraine had free farmers. And not just any farmers, chernozem, that rich black earth where almost anything grows. Ukraine holds more than a quarter of the world's entire supply of it. And on this land, the state decided there would be no private owners anymore. Anyone who had a little more than his neighbor, a couple of cows, a horse, a hired hand, was branded a kulak. Probably the closest word familiar in the West, the bourgeois. So feel the difference here. The Soviet authorities declared ordinary farmers, people who simply weren't poor, to be the bourgeois and, of course, enemy of the state. So armed men would come to these peasants, take their land, their livestock, their tools, load the person and his entire family into a cattle car and haul them thousands of kilometers away to Siberia, the Urals, to bare steppe of Kazakhstan. This was called dekulakization. In just one wave in 1931, 265,000 families were shipped off to these special settlements. That's almost 1.24 million people. In total, over a few years, more than 2 million. And because Ukrainian peasants resisted Moscow's rule the hardest, Stalin engineered an artificial famine in Ukraine that killed several million people. But that's a huge separate topic, we'll come back to it another time. So the land was taken and the people were herded into the kolkhoz, collective farm, where all the land, all the livestock, all the tools were now shared and the state ran everything. As I said at the very start, this was slavery in all but name, because people weren't paid money for their work. Officially, it was called a trudodень, a labor day. Here's how it worked. The state sorted every job on the farm into 7 to 9 categories by difficulty. A simple job was 1 labor day, a really easy one half, and the hardest, like operating heavy machinery, could be worth 4.5. You work a day, the bookkeepers draws a mark in the ledger, the same little stick. But that stick wasn't drawn for nothing. It was supposed to convert into something, because the state didn't feed or clothe these people. Except it all ran on an utterly twisted logic that only Russia could have invented. The stick had no fixed value, none at all. At the end of the year, the collective farm takes everything it grew, hands the state its share, and the state took the lion's share at artificially low prices. And whatever is left after the state is split among everyone, according to the number of sticks. Which means that for an entire year you have no idea what you're earning. Maybe you'll get lucky, maybe you won't. Here's our real numbers. 1946. In the Kiev region, one stick got you 150 grams of grain. And that's actually a decent figure. In other regions, they gave 100 grams or even 50. And in some places, nothing at all. Let's do the math. There were roughly 300 working days a year. 300 sticks at 100 grams each, that's 30 kilograms of grain. One sack. A sack of grain for a year of work. Money zero. No wonder that in the 1930s and 40s, work on the collective farm gave an average peasant family only about 5% of its cash income. 5%. Everything else you had to scrape together yourself, and we'll get to that. First, a bit more about how the kolkhoz system worked. Imagine you're that peasant. You grew this grain with your own hands. It's lying there in the field. Your child is hungry. You bend down and pick up just a few ears of wheat. And for that, they can shoot you. On August 7th, 1932, a law was passed on the protection of socialist property. People simply called it the Law of 5 Ears of Grain. Formally, it protected collective farm property from theft. In practice, for a few grains from the field, you got 10 years in the camps, or execution with confiscation of everything you owned. Amnesty was forbidden. In just the first month the law was in force, 150,000 people was convicted. 782 of them were shot over ears of grain. And here the Western viewer always asks the logical question. Fine, conditions are horrific, there's no money, they jail you over grain. Why not just leave? Get on a train, move to the city, to a factory, where at least there's some kind of wage. Because the peasant had no passport. At the end of 1932, the Soviet Union introduced a single internal passport system. Passports were given to everyone, workers, city dwellers, everyone except peasants. Collective farmers were not issued passports, literally, and this went on not for a year or two. Peasants were not given passport until 1974. Without a passport, you couldn't simply live. You had no right to go farther than the nearest town, the district center, without written permission from your bosses. And to give you a sense of the scale, as late as 1967, 58 million adults in the country were living without a passport, 37% of the population. This is slavery in the middle of Europe, lasting into the second half of the last century. And back to the question of money. If the collective farm didn't feed people, how did they survive at all? The answer: the household plot. A tiny piece of land beside the house, maybe a third to half a hectare. The state had to leave it because otherwise people would simply have died out. And on this scrap of land, after a full day's work on the collective farm, peasants worked at night as well to grow food for themselves. Here's a chilling statistic. These tiny gardens took up about 3% of all the sown land in the country. Only 3%, and they produced about 40% of all the meat and milk in the country, and nearly 2/3 of the potatoes and eggs. 3% of the land where a person worked for himself fed half of the country, and the 97% where he worked for a stick fed almost no one. That's the shortest lecture in the world on the difference between motivation and coercion. But Russia wouldn't be Russia if it had simply left people these plots. The state looked at them and decided, if you have a cow, a pig, an apple tree in your yard, pay up for every tree. And in the early 1950s, it reached genuine absurdity. They taxed not the apple harvest, but the trunk itself, just for the fact that a tree exists. And the rate was 7.5 times higher than on grain crops. And exactly what you'd expect happened. People started cutting down their own orchards en masse. Because whether the tree bears fruit or not is anyone's guess, but the tax on it, you pay that today. This tax was only repealed in 1954, but by then the orchards had already gone under the axe. Maybe you spotted a loophole, work badly in the field, and put more effort into your own garden. Well, that option didn't exist either. If a person didn't work off their minimum, that minimum was raised for them. And from 1939, they started expelling you from the collective farm for it. And again, don't let the wording fool you, because it sounds like they threw you out of slavery for working badly. No, for a person like that, taxes were sharply increased. And at the same time, they took away the very scrap of land where you could have grown something to hand over the state as tax. And failure to pay tax, that's already a criminal charge. And in the end, you were sent to the famous Gulag, a forced labor camp, where they'll make you work anyway at even harder labor. The Russian system doesn't have to be logical, it only has to be cruel and inhuman. And one more horrific side of the story, the exploitation of child labor. Because on the collective farms, children were sent to work from the age of 12. They had lower work quotas than adults, but a childhood in the fact they never had. The Soviet Union had the most fertile chernozem on the planet, the very soil for which people were robbed, deported, starved, and somewhere in the middle of its existence, the rulers of this empire had to admit it could no longer feed itself. Already by 1963, the Soviet Union began buying grain abroad in enormous quantities, most of all from Canada. And in 1972 came the episode America still remembers as the Great Grain Robbery. The Soviet Union quietly bought up about 19 million tons of grain in the United States, a quarter of the entire American wheat harvest for the year. Think about it, the country with the best land in the world was buying bread from the capitalists it had promised to bury, because its own peasants, turned into collective slaves working for a stick, could no longer wanted to grow anything. By the way, this is one of the pillars of the Russian self-image, ambivalence toward the West, hating it and worshipping it at the same time. It was like that before the Soviet Union, and it's like that now. All the people threatening Europe and America with nuclear apocalypse keep their bank accounts and their mansions in the West, and sometimes their entire families live in the West. But that peculiarity of Russia is something we'll cover separately. So in the 1960s, several turning points come together. As I said, the state had to admit the collective farms were inefficient. Second, the Soviet Union started making money on oil and gas, so it had the hard currency to buy food abroad. Third, for the first time, city dwellers come to outnumber peasants. For these reasons, the Soviet Union eases up on their repression. But of course, not out of humanitarian concern, it simply stopped seeing it as necessary. In 1966, labor days are abolished and farmers start being paid a wage. Though for a long time it was still several times lower than the national average. Only in 1964 did the authorities decide to issue passports to peasants. But the passportization process itself was completely only in 1981. Can you imagine that? Slavery on the European continent was effectively abolished not in some far distant era. It happened just 8 years before I was born, for example. And when I say slavery, I'm not being dramatic, because if you compare it to that same slavery in America, the only difference was that a slave could be sold or lost in a card game, but only because the slaves belonged to the state. There was simply no one to sell them to. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe, because there's a lot more interesting stuff coming on this channel.